Recreating Us is a Neighbors International production. Neighbors International is committed to an asset-based focus of co-creative change, developing the capacity to welcome the diversity of gifts, knowledge, and experiences available in each one of us. Beth Mount is a social artist, a catalyst for co-creation, a writer, and the creator of Personal Futures Planning, a person-centered planning practice developed more than 40 years ago. Beth has guided people who care in creating the organizational and social conditions that allow people to thrive.
To see people in a different light, see people who are not usually seen for their gifts and their potentials and possibilities. Not only has that been important to the people and their families, but I also have operated from any group of people who are being left out, has gifts to bring, has something that we need to know and learn from them that is essential to our survival.
I'm Dave Hasbury, and in this conversation, we explore the journey to embody the gifts and higher purpose in all of us. We delve into Beth's practice of making the invisible visible, uncovering the power of attention, and visualizing patterns of conditions that allow people to thrive or inhibit and diminish capacity. We examine the impact of a history of attentional violence, structural devaluation, and structural violence. And we look at the co-creative change that comes through the weaving of relationships between a person, their support circle, service organizations, and the neighborhood where they live. Thanks for being here again and entering into a conversation. And a while ago, when we were chatting, and throughout different conversations that we've had, the phrase "making the invisible visible" has come up. And I always associate it with a number of people, but I certainly associate it with you, in part because so much of what you've done for so long is about making things visible. And so I wonder if you could talk for a bit about both parts, the making things visible, but then the other part about the invisible and the importance of making what is not seen. So I just wonder if you could talk for a bit about that in your work and how you process the world.
So let's see, making visible. Why am I so passionate about making the invisible visible? So I think I can't address that question without going back 50 years ago to when I first encountered people with disabilities in Milledgeville State School, the largest institution in the world at the time, by the way. Who were so abandoned and so dehumanized and so discarded in just deplorable conditions. 12, 15 people in a room with one staff person and a pole, barely clothed, a drain in the floor. I mean, no sense that people are people. And there's no question that something inside me then clicked that just felt the injustice of that, right? The wrongness of that, and that the challenge of discovering what would be involved in creating conditions where people could not only become visible in their humanity, but actually thrive, became really my journey of these last 50 years. And so, I don't think I've ever let go of that question. And not only have I held that question about supporting people for supporting us to see people in a different light, see people who are not usually seen for their gifts and their potentials and possibilities. Not only has that been important to the people and their families, but I also have operated from an understanding, and actually this is a reference point for this. It comes also from Carl Jung, who has had a big influence on how I think about both the visible and the invisible. But one of Jung's teachings was related to this notion that every marginalized group of people in any society is actually bringing something to that society that it needs to evolve and to grow. And so any group of people who are being left out and, in a sense, carrying the shadow of the dominant culture has gifts to bring, has something that we need to know and learn from them that is essential to our survival. And so, so having grown up during the civil rights era, right, and watching the impact of the African American Black community in Atlanta, Georgia, becoming visible and becoming lifted up, and the potential and the possibilities being seen by the wider culture, and the incredible dynamic and power of that movement, of that social movement. To me, what we've been doing in the disability world has a similar call to it, which is the world needs us. The world needs this reality in order to be a healthier society.
So I'm interested. Well, first of all, I love that notion of that which has been marginalized and rejected actually holds a gift for the wider communal life that we have. So I really love that. And I know that the Milledgeville experience actually again, made naked the dehumanizing of people. But when you were there, what did you see? Aside from the treatment of people, what did you see in the people themselves that gave that? It just strikes me that in order to feel that somebody's been dehumanized, we actually have to see the humanity in somebody. So what did you see among these people who were being treated awfully?
Well, I think it's important to also pull the camera back and make note of the fact that I had grown up with people in my family who were living with a disability, people in my family or my community. In all the places we lived when I was a child, we always had a neighbor who had a child with a disability at home. And that was back in the day before 94-142, before kids with disabilities went to public schools. So they were just at home, and they were with their families. And my own brother had a very complicated existence. And there were other members of our family who had been living with disabilities and might have still been kind of hidden away, or not very, their lives had not been necessarily very developed in community, but they were not. That was back in the day when one really only had two choices: to keep your loved one at home or to put them in an institution. And the system really encouraged families to institutionalize their loved ones, right? So I think on some level, what I was aware of at that moment was that the individuals in this room are no different from the people that I've grown up with. They're just living in conditions that are horrendous. And, and so if that's the case, then we, the collective we, could do something about this.
Well, one of the things that you've mentioned and thought about is this idea of making visible what goes missed by a lot of people because of the kind of global overarching kind of view of people. But you have this thing about making visible pockets of possibility. So like experiences where small things happen that actually many people would miss. And then, but for you, there's something about actually lifting those up in some way so that they can be seen. Can you talk a little bit about both the process of noticing those pockets of possibilities and then the kind of what it takes to actually lift those up to be seen?
Well, this is a continuation of the theme of making visible, because the early formation of personal futures planning was, in fact, a pedagogy. It was a process of supporting people to tell their story and having it unfold, literally become visible on wall charts across a wall with a group of people who were invested in the individual and interested in change. And what we learned early on is that, and this is one of my signature gifts, I believe, was just this very simple color coding that I've stuck with for almost 50 years, which is green was the color for when things were going well and people were alive and, conditions and experiences were uplifting. And red was the color of things not going well, when people were stuck, when conditions were not good. And we learned early on in that if we just stay true to a certain amount of color coding, that what emerged on the paper were themes in people's lives, threads. In retrospect, I've come to call them the kind of the soul's DNA, that what we began to see is a pattern in who people are when they're at their best, and a pattern in who people are when they're at their worst. And 9 times out of 10, people were spending most of their lives locked into the pattern of when they were at their worst. Okay. So this was a very revelatory experience, right? To literally see themes kind of jump off the wall. And, I am looking for my yellow markers. The other color that I am famous for is yellow, is the yellow highlighter, because one of the things that we did rigorously in those early days, and I still do this if I'm involved in a plan, is we start underlining in yellow, where is this key to this person's life? Where is this gift? Where is this pattern that if we can redirect our attention to the green, we can strengthen? Okay, well, it doesn't take long before a beautiful vision can unfold for the person. However, if we're not also taking on the organizational constraints, the what we now call the social body, the place that people live and belong, if we're not also opening up opportunities in that part of people's lives, then what we've identified as what's possible can't unfold. So then this brings us back to making visible what is the pattern in a person and what are the opportunities in a place, the place that they live in, and how do we strengthen the connection one little experience at a time. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough, because in our practice, while we might generate a fairly large vision for what could be a more generative, fruitful life, oftentimes that's a 10-year vision that emerges. It's not a 6-month vision. It's not a 12-month vision. It doesn't fit into any of our ideas about time. But what matters is that we find seeds from that big vision that we can start to plant. And many of the stories I've told over the years, they truly begin with 2 hours. People made a shift in Ken's life from a situation that was really not working to finding these 2 hours where he could start to really shine. And then, okay, that's a key. What can we do to enlarge that, right? And what can we do to keep building people's engagement in the things that really nurture them? So the point is just that the person-centered planning that I've practiced has always had connected to it planning with the person and their family, working with an organization to change, and also being connected in the community, working at the level of local community to find assets and places where people can belong and contribute in the local community. And if we disconnect those 3 things, really it's 4 things, because I mentioned finding the gifts in the person with their support circle. That's actually number 2. Gifts in an individual, cultivating relationships, the support circle, changing organizations, and building communities. If you disconnect a plan from any of those things, you come back 3 or 4 years later and nothing's happened, and people have been left with this sense of possibility and just stuck in same old situations.
So in the early, and continues to be, but in the early part of making things visible for you, it was simply colors, like speak and record in colors according to these criteria. It actually fosters growth and brings the best out, or it actually diminishes who somebody is. And so colors was an important part of that. The sense of the parts being uncovered and engaged. So a person discovery of a person, discovery of the people who care about that person, discovery about the capacity of an organization, and discovery about a community, all of those being important things. I'm sitting in front of me. I have the quilt that you created called the Garden of Soul, which we're on a podcast, so it's, people can't see what it is, but it's an absolutely gorgeous vision. And your work over the years has had combinations of style. Some are actually collecting what people are creating and curating them into an image. And sometimes it's you actually working through your own understanding. Mm-hmm. I get the sense that the Garden of Soul is a little bit of that it's about you trying to make sense of the world, but we'll make available in the description how people can see this, and the companion article that goes with it called We Are Companions on a Journey. But in it, and the reason I'm coming here is because of what you said about these 4 parts, and I wonder about the connection. In it, the top section of the image is a large star with a 4-sectioned cross in the center of the star. And you mentioned Carl Jung earlier. You mentioned color. And I know from the little that I know of Carl Jung, that symbols is an important part of the power of symbols. And this gets to the making visible part. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that star and what that's, because that stars show up in your artistic work often. They're important pieces. And I wonder if you could just talk about the star and what the importance of that as a symbol is to those four parts that you mentioned earlier: the person, the circle, the organization, and the community. Talk a little bit about the star and why is that important to you and can be to others.
Well, you're right. The star shows up in so much of what I do, and there are many layers for why it feels important to me. And so let's start with the universal understanding of the star throughout all time and in all cultures. The star represents, and in all religions and all everything, the star metaphorically represents a guide, right? And in the first peoples, for most of humanity, the stars have guided people, right? So there's literally the stars that guide us, and then there's metaphorically the soul's higher purpose for us. So once again, the star represents, in my imagination, what Carl Jung calls this daemon, which is the call, right? That we each are here with a purpose and a defining image. And James Hillman calls this both the understanding that every one of us has a star and the deciphering of that meaning of that star as the soul's code. So we have a soul. Our soul has wisdom. Our soul is like a companion, and it's our work, and it's a lifetime, right? We're all in this. We're all discovering what is the mark we make, what is the DNA that I cultivate, that I develop, and how do I live that? How do I live that out so that I'm living into my higher purpose? And in our work, we're supporting other people to live into their higher purpose. Because sadly, throughout history, this notion of a higher purpose was sort of colonized for people who were privileged. And the idea that everybody else who doesn't have a certain amount of privilege is sort of an underling to other people's call, to other people's star. So we live at a time, thankfully, as challenging as this moment is for other reasons, where almost all marginalized groups are calling, are making a stronger case for their capacity to live into a higher purpose and to have conditions. I mean, often we call the limitations of living into a higher purpose that are structural violence, that this notion of structural violence is not even necessarily a really aggressive thing. Of course, it shows up that way. But structural violence limits people and limits the people who support people to see and imagine those possibilities and then to have a better shot at reaching for those possibilities. Okay, so that's sort of the big picture of why the star is meaningful. Then there is the contribution that John O'Brien and Connie Lyle O'Brien have brought into our work, which is helping us interpret the meaning of inclusion, the possibility of inclusion, using 5 valued experiences. And I won't go into that because it's in a lot of our writing. Frankly, it shows up, not only does it show up The five valued experiences, the star shows up in almost every artwork that I've ever done. The five valued experiences show up in virtually anything that I've ever written because it provides such a clear picture of what we're reaching for in this work of supporting people to live into their highest possibility. And because I've known John and Connie and I've been connected with them almost 50 years and was a part of that early formation of those ideas, I can't imagine doing this work without the clarity that comes from those five valued experiences. It's not that we ever even get there necessarily, but that it just serves as a guide for us in our work and in the measure of how we're doing. How are we doing? How are we really doing at supporting each person to live into those five valued experiences in a multitude of different ways? So there's, this simple idea that there's five valued experiences, and then there's this incredibly complex actualization that varies widely from life to life, right? But still, it helps illuminate what we're doing.
So the star is, and I would, because of what you mentioned about the historical guide that stars have been, it is very resonant for people. There's that kind of sense. It's one of those things that's a simple symbol, but it actually ties into something. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that. And you briefly mentioned it, but just, you talked about structural violence. And in many ways, this is kind of the contra to structural violence, because the structural violence is rooted in seeing people in a certain way as not being human, as not being whole, as not being valued, as all of that kind of stuff. And when we devalue people, we can do terrible things to them. We see that now happening in broad strokes around the world, that as soon as we actually see others as less than, as not even, as inhuman, as all these kinds of things, it unleashes a parade of structural violence in people's lives. And I wonder what your experience has been, or how you see your experience of introducing these ideas of the star and higher purpose. What happens when you take those to places where people are kind of stuck in a lot of ways? What happens in how people shift when they're given the opportunity to just take a look at their situations differently than they've historically been handed them? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. Let me take a shot at interpreting an idea. So the other concept that's directly related to structural violence is attentional violence. So, and this is an Otto Scharmer term that suggests that, and the two things go side by side, that attentional violence is not to be seen in terms of your highest purpose. And it hits hardest those who are at the margins, right? So, and attentional violence is frozen, is interlocked, I should say, with structural violence. So we have structures of society that are hardened in a way that diminish lots of people and keep them stuck in attentional violence. So let's just take that back to even the color coding. When I look back now, I can see that what we were doing in our simple color coding was just shifting our attention, right? Like together, we were becoming aware that here is this information in the green about what works for people and where life is for them. And here is this information in the red about what doesn't work and where people are hurting or stuck. And here is a pattern in the green, like a DNA of what's possible being revealed to us on these charts. And as we sit here and see this, we want to break the chain, right? We want to shift from attentional violence to attentional potential, right? So we want, as allies, we want to use everything we can to focus on potential, not the invisible sides of people. And so we want to bring ourselves to shift these patterns. The challenge is that the issue's always much bigger than just the individual. So if we can't find ways to also shift the patterns in the way we show up in organizations, in our communities, in our families, and our relationships, then it's extremely hard to hold on to the shifts that are possible for people. Right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, so it's very important to, when you think about the star in the visual garden of soul, it's very important to appreciate that the star is only part of the whole big picture. That the equally important focus of that image is what I call on the ground, right? It's in the bottom of this image. And the ground is where the real work happens. And that's what I call a garden of soul, right? If you're not cultivating the garden, we can do all the pretty pictures in the world. We can do all the plans and they can be beautiful and we can bring in all kinds of art, but that's not the point of the art. The point of everything we're doing, the point of social art is to get down, to go deeper into the ground that people are living in, walking on, living with every day, the constraints, the red, the possibilities, the blue, and to dig deeper, to work harder at that part of the puzzle, of the picture. And one reason I felt called to make that image is I had been working in New York State with both OPWDD, the state, and also young people coming out of District 75, special ed in New York City schools. I'd already been doing that work for 15 years, okay? And the way that I construct my initiatives around person-centered work, they're always focused on a handful of people. And I do everything I can to follow those people for years. So there are people that I've been a part of their journey that I've been following what's happening for them for 40, 45 years. Now, that's important because as time was passing then, this was in 2008 when I started that image, 25 years already of doing person-centered work, it was just blindingly clear that when things were going well for people, they had a garden, right? The real work was being done on the ground to cultivate the conditions for people to thrive. And where things had not taken off, that hadn't happened. And unfortunately, that was also at a time where person-centered planning was becoming more and more popular. And from my point of view, it was becoming disembodied from this other half of the picture, right? That everybody's all excited about the plan. And look, I'd be the first to say that's the most that's always where I would rather be. I would always rather be in a room with people and their families and allies creating a plan. It's thrilling to be a part of that. It's just that if we're not also paying attention to these other ways to shift, we're not doing the work. And so the making of Garden of Soul was my way. Talk about making visible. You see, I could have told that story through a comparative analysis, right? Much like I did in my dissertation, where there's a group of people who are involved in this and there's a control group who are not having this experience, and we watch and follow what happens over time, right? But first of all, what good does that kind of analysis do in the world that I inhabit? The artwork has the potential to really tell a bigger story. And so in summary, what that one piece of art seeks to convey, is what I could see, having followed hundreds and hundreds of people over time, that when we could align those conditions at the bottom of the image, life could become really interesting for people. When we could not, things didn't go anywhere and people would just stay stuck. And it's very important to emphasize that this had nothing to do with what the limits were that people individually faced. So people who were profoundly behaviorally challenged or cognitively labeled with very severe cognitive impairments, they could thrive with the right garden, with the right conditions. And people who had much less challenging learning issues could stay completely and totally stuck in the absence of the cultivation of that social field, that garden of soul.
Well, there's a lot in this, and I want to come back to that garden part in just a second. But I want to step back for a bit, because you referenced two phrases that had to do with violence. One was attentional violence. And I got the sense that in many ways that was about how our attention is shifted away from who somebody is and either makes them invisible or actually believes there's something that magnifies a part of them that hides other parts of them. And so what happens when you're not seen is like a violence, it's like who you are is violated by that. And I think that's a very common thing. And I think it's something that we all have to be very aware of, how we participate in that. But I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what the structural violence part is. What you mentioned that Otto puts those two side by side, attentional and structural violence. What's the structural part? How is that recognized? How do we see that?
Well, so when I think about structural violence, I immediately go back to my early experience with normalization / social role valorization, where through the lens of the body of work that Wolf Wolfensberger brought us, we could go in as a team in a 5-day review of all kinds of human service settings and take apart what we were seeing that organization doing across 50 different lenses, ratings, 50 different ratings. And it would become rather astonishing to see how these organizations were structured around devaluation. And I actually prefer, in our world, I prefer now the use of structural devaluation almost over structural violence, because when we use the word structural violence, we all kind of go, wait a minute, we're not doing anything that's hurtful to people. Okay. But devaluation is much more subtle and much more pervasive. And of course, it cuts across all kinds of communities. Devaluation, it's racism, it's homophobia, it's devaluation comes up in refugee crisis, you name it. But what this lens of normalization did is it helped us understand how locked in these organizations were to devaluation without even really knowing this, right? And fortunately, in the early years of person-centered planning, the organizations that hosted person-centered planning, they wanted to change. And once they saw this, in the same way, once we saw what was possible for people on a chart, once we saw where we were stuck as organizations and what might be if we made really significant changes, organizations made huge changes. They moved out of group programs. They moved out of, they moved away from congregation to real individualized supports. And that was almost 50 years ago, because they had the insight and they were activated to make these changes, and they had a certain authority to make these changes, partly because the supports were so undeveloped. So, people, in a way, people had more freedom then. So there's no question, for example, in America, because the majority of our supports that are available to people with disabilities and their families are Medicaid supports, that we have inherited a medical model. Whether we like it or not, we live under the shadow of a framework for funding that is inherently medicalized and reinforces practices that lock us in to not seeing whole people. We're obsessed with labels and 15-minute increments and paperwork and so on and so forth. And that becomes really clear when you visit people in other countries. They may have way less funding for services, but it's not a medical model. Now, it doesn't mean to say that they don't have their own variation or version of devaluation, right? Everybody does.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's important. And while I certainly understand the notion of structural devaluation is what allows structural violence to actually,
of course.
I mean, it's like the precursor to the actual, you mentioned your first story of Milledgeville and the one person in a room of 18 people with a pole at the door and a hole in the ground and prodding people to kind of stay away from each other or all that kind of stuff. Clearly those people were devalued, but the way they would be treated. And I know my entry into this work was in a whole behavioral thing, the things that were done to people, that were literal violence, and they were structurally enforced violence, like they were made legitimate by the structural devaluation. They kind of said, there's a reason why we're doing this to people. And we've done that historically. It certainly exists. So anyway, I appreciate that. So I want to talk a little bit more about the garden and cultivation, because that is, as you mentioned, it's actually the bigger part of the quilt is the cultivating part. And I want you to just pick some of those things that you feel we need to attend to in our cultivation. What are the kinds of things that we have the power to actually engage with? So take us on a journey into cultivating. Make us all gardeners.
Okay.
Or farmers. Yeah.
So in the center of this piece, between the star and the garden, is a hand, is a hamsa. It's a hand that symbolizes, once again, in almost every culture, the handprint symbolizes the mark that we make. And also the hamsa represents a protective energy that is a guide for us, another source of guidance. So it's a powerful symbol in almost every culture. And so when you think about gardening, unless you're in, some kind of agricultural machine-like gigantic thing, I'm talking about little gardens. Let's use the image. Let's not use the big agricultural industry. Let's use the little gardens that are outside in the backyard, in countless, whether they're vegetable gardens or flower gardens or gardens of creatures, but that the work of the hands is key. Like we actually, and so the hands in this work, first of all, they symbolize as many of us as possible getting our hands involved on the plow, if you will, right? And in particular, valuing and bringing in the hands, the intelligence, the wisdom of the people who provide the most support, which are usually parents, direct support allies, teachers, right? The people who are with people every day. So we wouldn't even think or talk about this issue of cultivating the garden without lifting up the people who are actually providing real care, real support on a day-to-day basis. So the hand means a lot of different things, but it's right there in the middle. So just want to emphasize that. And the hand is the connection, it's the link, it's the bridge to this garden space. And inside that garden space are different elements of what we pay attention to. So, all right, we keep in mind that all of this work is about how we use our attention. So one of the most important images is a circle of support. It's an individual with 4 or 5 people in their lives, and with the support circle, that dramatically increases the possibility that we're going to hold on to that star together, and we're going to support each other to work towards it. And we're going to be involved in the journey in a mutual, as equals, and mutually. We're all gardening. We're all living daily lives that are complicated. Maybe the person with the disability is at the center of a circle, but everyone's life matters in that circle. So that circle is sort of the first order of a space that's holding on to potential and taking on the things that need to be in place in order for life to unfold. There's another image that is a neighborhood. So the neighborhood represents another aspect of what are we paying attention to. the neighborhoods that people live in. And of course, this is another element of my orientation to all of this work. I mean, people have heard me say, if you don't know what's in people's neighborhoods, I don't want to talk to you about a person-centered plan. Because what's in people's neighborhoods oftentimes contains as much information about what might be possible for people as any of the planning and thinking about the individual. So that's a whole other podcast, how we discover what the possibilities are, the wisdom in a neighborhood, the openings in a neighborhood, and how we discover that, and how we support people to make connections in their local neighborhoods. And that doesn't take away from the possibility that you might learn to use a subway to go from Brooklyn to Staples in Manhattan to work on a job, right? To talk about knowing the neighborhood doesn't mean that we're limiting people's choices.
Sure.
But it does mean that we're tapping into a gold mine that we don't even know where the gold is until we spend more time in people's neighborhoods. Okay, there's another square in that garden. Think about each one of these things as a part of the garden that you're cultivating. The other square has to do with how are we finding a variety of ways for people to show up? How are we increasing the resources that people have, the opportunities? That's what I'm looking for. How do we increase the opportunities people have to live into a richer life? And of course, there's infinite number of possibilities, but the four that we focus on the most in the work that I do all these years is, let's see what we can do to build more relationships. That's one. Hopefully there's a support circle to start with, but there's more relationships to cultivate. One can't have too many, really. But it takes a lot of work to cultivate those relationships. There is the issue of neighborhood, what's on your block. There is the issue of work and volunteerism. So, supporting people to have real jobs in real communities has always been the heart of personal futures planning. And so in every plan that I've ever been a part of, even with the most complicated people anywhere, we're asking the question about vocation. What is the job that we can imagine people growing into? Where is the opportunity for economic development? So we're trying to increase the money that people have to live on and live with, and more importantly, or as importantly, a valued role with high expectations that comes with real work. Okay, then finally, in that one area of the garden is this question of associational life. So how are we doing at discovering where associations are and helping people belong, be members, step in, have a role, and cultivate relationships? Okay, so that's that part of the garden. Right, and so last but not least, and then there's a middle point that's important to mention. The fourth area is what I think of as a design team. It's a slightly different group of people that are organized around the star, but they probably have an organizational role in all of this. So they are people in a person's life who are working administratively in an administrative role to find funding, right? To create more flexibility, to support people, to have good personal support, to deal with the countless ways that bureaucracy interferes. And I think of bureaucracy as like a pest, like anybody who keeps a garden is very alert to the pest that come in and eat your leaves, and it's not only bugs but also rabbits and deer, like who's going to eat this and who's going to devour that. And no matter how beautiful those flowers are, if you haven't paid attention to kind of safeguarding the pest, it's you're going to get eaten alive, right? Those new possibilities are going to be eaten. Well, so a design team, one of the things a design team does is kind of firewall as best they can this garden from the pest and find new ways to bring in more energy, resources, good people, and intelligence, right, into the situation. So I will say, just finish on this note, that when we are getting all of those things, when we're attending to all of those things, so I would never say getting all of those things right, because I don't know, there's no such thing as getting all these things right. The challenge is attending as best we can. Then we have not only a garden of soul, but also what I call a pocket of possibility. That a pocket of possibility is a place where the conditions have been cultivated for people to live their best life. Right? And so.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I love I don't even want to call it a metaphor, although it is a kind of external experience. The whole garden idea is anybody who's spent any time in a garden with your hands dirty and then watching something grow, like going from the early spring season when the ground is gray and there's nothing growing until gradually something happens that things start to grow. It's a very powerful way of exploring this. What interests me a lot in this, though, is the notion of tending a garden. That's the language that's used. You tend a garden, right? And you talk about attending, you talk about attention. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, let me step back. I see that our ability to hold attention long enough for things to grow is pretty fragile. And so I wonder what you see. I mean, obviously all those things that you mentioned in that tending, including the design team kind of thing, but what makes it possible for people to hold their attention long enough for something to grow, and not only long enough for it to start to grow, but to sustain it? I know earlier you talked about, watching relationships and people over 40 years. And I know, if you're like the people I know, that it's like every year in the garden is a different year. And if you're not paying attention, it can all not grow or the pests can take over. So anyway, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. What does it take to keep our attention, even if it's not perfect? It's like, what I see so often is that people's attention is sucked out of them. They're actually not able to pay attention because of the structural things that are in place. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what it takes for us to hold our attention long enough for something to grow.
Well, I think what you're naming is the crisis of our time, right? So there's a crisis in humanity at the moment, where it's getting increasingly difficult for people to hold their attention on creating the conditions, cultivating the relationships between people, and cultivating the quality of the relationships between people. And so it's a crisis, this capacity to cultivate and attend. And I think I can't address that question without talking about love. So, the first thing that comes to my mind when you ask how we do that, well, the people who do that best in general are people's families, are the parents, right? Starting with the parents. Now, not everybody has parents. I don't mean to, grandma, the core, the place where one has grown up and belongs, for better, for worse, as challenging as every single family is. There's no such thing as, this sort of, at least I don't know, if there is this sort of bubbling, perfect family, forget about it. That's ridiculous. But family is the place where, if we're fortunate, we have experiences of being cared for and about, and our potential is nurtured. And so much of what unfolds for people happens through the commitment, the devotion that comes with love. So that said, we know that families get beaten down to the ground with all the complexities of getting through the day, and services and organizations that hurt more than help, and all the other complexities of devaluation. So I'm not romanticizing families, and I'm not suggesting that. And that's why we work so hard to create good supports that are other people who come in and bring everything they can, their best intention, bring their love into a person's development, into a sense of what's possible for people. And, we don't talk about love enough, right? Because it's such a mystery. And yet I found a quote by one of my mentors, Dinga McCannon, who is an amazing artist. And but I think this quote really fits what we're talking about here. Dinga says, an artist lives on faith, the kind of faith that the image comes. So imagine that what we're thinking about here, the image, it's that star of possibility. The potential comes. The new is born with love. You fall in love with every creation, and you want to see it through. If you don't fall in love, you will not stick with it. Period. You won't stick with it. You have no idea how it will turn out, but you trust the process. You trust that what you do to create order out of what is generally a very messy, chaotic reality will heal the world. I love that, right? Because here is a story quilter. Number one, falling in love with every piece, but imagining that her devotion to each creation has some small ripple in healing the world. I think that's hugely important for us in our work.
Absolutely.
Maybe not even in your lifetime, but in some way you might never understand. So this might, these things we hold so dear, they truly might not be actualized in our lifetime, but things will happen that we don't understand. Something always comes from your commitment to the process. You will have no idea what that might be, but the new is revealed through the creative process. So, for me, Dinga's way of thinking about creativity ties together this quality of falling in love, ties together devotion, the commitment to sticking with it, no matter how confusing and difficult this is, and truly imagining that devotion in some small way that you can't possibly fathom is healing the world, right? Like, oh my gosh, okay. This is not a person-centered plan. This is in some small way, maybe healing the world. And that something new will be revealed, And I think that's a big part of what keeps us engaged is we anticipate, we want to be a part of the revelation, right? We want to see what can come from our commitment and our puzzles and our struggle and our confusion and our challenges. We want to see what might come, and then we want to celebrate that. We want to tell those stories. We want to lift those up. And every time something surprising and generative happens in the life of one person, we want to imagine what it might take to do that on behalf of some more folks.
Well, it is interesting that we live in a very antiseptic world, and so the notion of love doesn't get addressed nearly enough because sustainability does require love. You must love something in order for you to sustain the journey to kind of be with that which you love and the who that you love as they go through all this. And it relates to me to another element, which is gift. So any of the parents that I've known, and including myself, when a child comes into your life, when a child has come into their life, there is this sense of being gifted. There's this sense of receiving this awesome mystery in your life. And then as you watch that person grow, no matter what their capacities are, you watch how they navigate the world, and it kind of just enhances that sense of gift that comes from them. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of uncovering, discovering, naming gifts, and how we attend to discovering what people's gifts are. Because for me, the falling in love is in the exchange of gifts. When you actually bring something to someone else's life, consciously or unconsciously, it brings something out that in that person. So I wonder if you could just talk for a bit about your understanding of gift and how we actually can uncover what gifts are for the thing that you talked about, Dinga mentioning, the kind of changing the world kind of element comes from the exchange of gifts, the falling in love, and the thing that comes from those things that you can't even predict what it would be. So anyway, I just toss it out to you as something to think about, because it's been an important part of the language that many of us have shared for a long time, the notion of everyone has a gift.
And a person who comes to mind who's spoken more wisely and more eloquently than anybody I know about gifts is Judith Snow, right? So I think if we want to understand giftedness, the discovery of gifts and what's involved in cultivating gifts, Judith is an incredible philosopher and artist to learn from. And so for people who don't know Judith, I think it's fair to say she was the first person who created a support circle in our world, right? The Joshua Committee, which was created to support her to move out of a nursing home with all the challenges that she had. And so Judith navigated her life for many years until she passed a few years ago in a kind of brilliant way, in need of constant support and very complex support. And there's a quote from Judith that I think resonates for me in the question about gifts. She says, sustained, vibrant relationship demands that the person with a disability be viewed with a different vision and listened to with a different ear. foremost of all the alternative possibilities is to see and hear the person as a welcome fellow traveler. We must see our shared journey, our shared life journey, as one of transforming human suffering by creating the supportive relationships we all need to sustain life, and of celebrating together life's joys and victories and surprises. And so I think of Judith when I think of the question of finding gifts, because that's one of those multi-dimensional ideas, giftedness, that yes, there's the specific gift that each of us brings, that of being a good listener, or sense of humor, or care about other people, or creativity, whatever those things might be. But then there's this bigger sense of giftedness, which is that Judith was so insistent upon, which is that society needs me, it needs us, people with disabilities, it needs our giftedness, our presence, in order to strengthen itself, right? In order for society to evolve. And so that to me is such an important element of thinking about giftedness, because there's the individual giftedness that we hope to uncover and reveal in our journey with people. But then there's this other quality of healing, healing a society that doesn't know how people might support each other, that doesn't appreciate vulnerability and dependency, and the quality of relationships that can grow from that when we treasure vulnerability, right? When we treasure complexity and interdependence.
Thank you. That's great. Well, I think that there were many things that you shared that were important, but I think one of the things that I'm taking from this is the attention element, and how we can pay attention. Because out of 168 hours in a week, how much time are we devoting to the attention necessary to cultivate relationships, gifts, connectedness, and to ultimately heal the society? It is probably one of those times when it feels like the things that we know are valuable to the lives of the people with disabilities that we've come to know, they are as valuable to the rest. Only we can pretend like we can survive without them, and the people that we've come to know who are more vulnerable in some aspects of their life need these things in order to survive. Relationships are vital in order to survive. Being seen as an equal is vital in order to survive. Making a contribution is not just a good thing, it's actually going to keep you more likely to being able to participate and take care of your own life as well as the life of other people. So anyway, the attention piece is really an important thing for me, that I was grabbing from this, along with all the rest, which I'm glad is recorded because I can always listen to it again. So for a future podcast, I would love to have a conversation with you that is about, so let me say, when people get a chance to take a look at the Garden of Soul quilt, they will be in awe of how beautiful it is. It's just full of color and richness. And the beauty can be distracting because I know from other things that you've done and the way that you work and how you think is that the incredible process of making something is where where things really lie. All the thinking, the imagining, the feeling, the kind of making sense, all of that stuff that's behind this beautiful image is important. And I'd love to have a conversation with you about that. And I'd love to have a conversation with you about how inviting other people into that process of making actually can unleash all of that as well in them. So anyway, we will do that on another time. But thanks a lot for spending the time with us now, and all the best in what's going on for the rest of the week. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for future episodes, exploring more aspects of what it takes to recreate a more inclusive and dynamic experience of us. Please subscribe to our podcast at your favorite podcast outlet.